The wreckage always tells the story first. 60-ton Abrams tanks lined up on a concrete pier, engines cold, turrets facing nothing but open water, 10,000 nautical miles between them and a war that isn't waiting. Behind them, a whole armored brigade sits stalled, Bradley fighting vehicles, artillery batteries, roughly 900 support vehicles, gear enough to outfit close to 5,000 soldiers, all of it grounded by the same simple fact. Tanks don't swim. No cargo plane on Earth can lift a column of armor this heavy. So before that brigade fires a single round, it has already lost the fight to a much older enemy: geography. That's where this story has to start, because it's also where it ends. The answer to how do you move an entire army across an ocean turns out to be a ship almost nobody outside the Navy has ever heard of. A hull pushing 1,000 feet in length, able to swallow an entire brigade's worth of equipment, outrun ordinary freighters, and then unload itself on a stretch of coastline with no port, no crane, nothing waiting at all. Two ship classes carry that answer: the Bob Hope class and the Watson class, the quiet workhorses of American military sealift. To understand why they look the way they do, you have to walk backward from that lonely row of tanks on the pier to the war room decisions that built these ships in the first place. The geography problem never really goes away. Two oceans sit between American power and almost every battlefield it might ever be asked to fight on. Every bit of that power is expeditionary by definition. It means nothing until it crosses water. A division sitting in Georgia is not strength, it's potential. Strength is that same division standing on the correct beach on the correct day, and the country learned exactly how costly that distinction is back in 1990 when Iraq seized Kuwait. American heavy armor crawled toward the Middle East aboard aging cargo ships barely making 14 to 18 knots. A buildup that should have taken days stretched into weeks, and for every one of those weeks, a door stood open that an adversary could have walked straight through before a single tank arrived. The lesson landed hard. The most powerful army on the planet is worth nothing if it can't get there in time. Somebody always asks, why not just fly it in? Run the numbers, and the answer explains itself. A C-17 Globemaster, built precisely for heavy airlift, carries roughly 1 Abrams tank per flight. A single brigade fields close to 1,000 vehicles. Airlifting all of it would mean thousands of sorties, weeks of continuous round-the-clock flying, and a fuel bill running into the billions of dollars. A single ship crossing does the same job in one voyage. Steel is simply too heavy to fly, which is exactly why more than 90% of everything that goes to war travels by sea, and probably always will. The ocean isn't the cheap route, as it's the only route wide enough to carry the weight. So the requirement got written down in plain numbers. Put a full heavy armored brigade plus the support tail of an entire corps anywhere on the planet, which meant finding roughly 5 million additional square feet of deck space somewhere. 2 American shipyards built that answer between 1995 and 2002, 7 Bob Hope-class ships at Avondale in New Orleans, 8 Watson-class ships at NASSCO in San Diego. But the real challenge was never simply build something big. Anyone can build something big. The real challenge was 3 demands that actively work against each other. The first is raw mass. 58 Abrams tanks at 60 tons apiece isn't cargo in any ordinary sense. An ordinary deck buckles under that kind of load. The second is the shoreline itself, because the actual battlefield rarely offers a deep-water port standing ready, and if it does, that port is usually the first thing an enemy destroys. The third is time. Arrive late, and you might as well not have come at all. What the Navy needed was the speed of a warship wrapped inside the body of a freighter. Each demand alone is difficult. Stacked together, they look almost like a contradiction, so it's worth walking through exactly how the engineers pulled them apart, one at a time, starting with the piece you can measure straight off the pier. Raw structural weight is the most stubborn number of the 3. A single Abrams tank weighs more than 60 tons. Multiply that by 58, then add 48 tracked Bradleys and more than 900 wheeled vehicles. This isn't a stack of shipping containers set down gently by a crane. It's an army of steel that has to stay upright while the deck beneath it pitches through a heavy storm at sea. The engineers responded by building something closer to a floating parking structure. Nearly 400,000 square feet of cargo space, around 380,000 on the Bob Hope class, and roughly 393,000 on the Watson class, a more deck area than 8 football fields spread across 6 separate levels. Loaded, one of these ships displaces about 62,000 tons. Empty, the light ship weighs only around 29 to 35,000. More than half the entire vessel exists purely to hold cargo. But storage space alone was never the hard part. Flow was. 58 tanks packed into a hold do nothing but jam each other if they can't move. So designers built a network of internal ramps and elevators connecting the lowest deck to the highest, letting vehicles drive themselves level to level without ever hitting a bottleneck. The decks themselves are reinforced to absorb 60-ton loads rolling across them. Tens of thousands of tie-down points anchor the steel so nothing shifts as the ship pitches, and a high-volume ventilation system clears exhaust fast enough that hundreds of diesel engines firing up inside a sealed hull don't choke the air before the vehicles even reach the ramp. One more detail shaped the hull without anyone deciding it outright. The beam, the width, is locked at 106 feet, the old Panamax limit for passing through the Panama Canal. Stay under that number, and the fleet can slip between the Atlantic and Pacific through the canal, instead of sailing the long way around South America. Even the hull's dimensions turned out to be strategy, not just storage. With the loading problem solved, the harder half of the equation opens up because cargo isn't delivered until it's back on dry land, and the unloading side of things carries a variable nobody aboard the ship controls, whatever shoreline is actually waiting when it arrives. A commercial hull gets to assume a deep water port, fixed cranes, an intact key. In any serious contested fight, that deep water port is usually the first thing gone, cratered, mined, or simply denied. Strike that assumption away and most of the world's shipping becomes useless overnight. A massive vessel that can't unload itself is just a massive, motionless target. So the engineers flipped the problem on its head. Instead of designing a ship to reach a port, they designed a ship that could be a self-sustaining port, which is really the single idea the entire hull is organized around. It works 2 ways. First, roll on, roll off. Vehicles simply start their engines and drive themselves off. At the stern sits a slewing ramp, a steel bridge stretching hundreds of feet that can swing to either side to mate with a narrow berth, a barge, or a floating causeway even when the real pier has been reduced to rubble. Add side port ramps on both flanks and the ship can unload from the stern and both sides simultaneously, 3 separate paths off the ship at once instead of one crane working alone. That parallel unloading is the real secret behind emptying a ship carrying thousands of vehicles in about 96 hours. The speed doesn't come from a stronger crane. It comes from removing the crane from the critical path altogether. For whatever can't roll off on its own, ammunition pallets, shipping containers, helicopters, there's lift-on, lift-off capability. 2 single-pedestal twin cranes, each rated at 55 tons, working together in tandem to hoist up to 110 tons, enough to lower cargo directly onto landing craft when no pier exists at all. Drive-off ramps handle everything that rolls. Tandem cranes handle everything that doesn't, and the ship empties itself onto a bare, broken, or improvised shoreline with nothing waiting for it. No borrowed crane, no intact dock. The port arrived built into the hull, which quietly solves 2 of the 3 original demands. Both solutions, though, only work once the ship is already sitting on station. The third demand runs on an entirely different axis, or not how much you're carrying or where you set it down, but how quickly the whole system closes the distance in the first place. This is where ordinary cargo ship design gives up. A commercial hull is optimized for cost per ton mile, and that math always points towards slow. A full heavy hull, a modest engine, 14 to 18 knots. Over a long crossing, those few knots compound into extra days, and days are exactly the window an adversary uses to dig in, seed mines, or position a submarine along the route. A self-deploying port that shows up after the fight is already lost is nothing but expensive scrap that happens to float. Both ship classes were built to hit 24 knots, but they arrived there by two completely different engineering philosophies. A deliberate choice by the Navy to split its bets across two separate propulsion systems rather than depend on one. The Bob Hope class runs on 4 Colt peel stick diesel engines, producing a combined 65,000 shaft horsepower, burning heavy fuel oil that's cheap, durable, and proven for long hauls. The Watson class instead runs on a pair of General Electric marine gas turbines, essentially jet engines adapted for the sea, the same engine family that powers Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Ticonderoga-class cruisers, producing roughly 64,000 horsepower, combined, compact, and able to spin up to full power almost instantly from a cold start. Same top speed, 2 different roads to get there. The diesel trades size for fuel efficiency, the gas turbine trades fuel for an unmatched power-to-weight ratio. Both drive controllable pitch propellers whose blades physically rotate to change how they bite the water, letting the ship reverse thrust or fine-tune its speed at a pier without ever shutting the engines down. Fuel was never really the constraint. Both classes can sail from the American East Coast all the way to the Persian Gulf without refueling once. The real constraint was always the clock. 24 knots isn't a bragging number, it's strategic arithmetic. On a transatlantic run, it shortens the crossing from roughly 8 days down to 5 or 6, shrinking the window an enemy has to exploit. Speed alone still can't beat the Pacific, though. 10,000 nautical miles is still more than 2 weeks at sea, no matter how fast the hull moves. And the only way to claw those weeks back is to stop counting the clock from home. At that point, it stops being an engineering problem and becomes a doctrine problem. Mass, shoreline, time, each one engineered down into something solvable on its own. The real payoff only shows up once all 3 live inside a single hull at the same time, because that's the moment the ship stops being a vehicle and becomes a strategy. Accept the self-sustaining port as the underlying design, and these ships turn into 2 distinct doctrines plus 1 real-world proof of concept. The first doctrine erases the ocean before a crisis even starts. It's called a float prepositioning, built almost entirely around the Watson class. Load a brigade's complete equipment, set onto these ships, and keep them anchored at strategic crossroads around the world, Diego Garcia, Guam, Japan. When a crisis breaks, the soldiers themselves don't sail anywhere. They carry only their personal weapons, fly in aboard a C-17 to a secure airfield near the fight, and meet the ship as it steams into a regional port, drops its ramp, and rolls the tank straight out. Deployment time for a heavy brigade collapses from months down to days. That's not transportation anymore, that's deterrence, a floating threat already positioned before the crisis ever begins. The second doctrine is Surge Sealift, and it belongs mostly to the Bob Hope class. These ships sit in American ports in a reduced operating status, kept running by skeleton crews as small as 10 to 26 people. When the order comes down, that crew has to assemble a full complement, light the engines, and clear port within roughly 96 hours. This is the exact machine that carried the equipment of the 101st Airborne and the 3rd Infantry Division to the Gulf back in 2003, when Military Sealift Command surged 17 of these ships and effectively built a bridge of steel across the Atlantic. Then there's the proof, the moment all of this stopped being theory. In 2024, the Bob Hope-class ship Roy P. Benavides sailed out of Newport News carrying the components of a floating causeway. The Trident Pier bound for Gaza, where the entire shoreline infrastructure had been flattened. Working alongside the Army's 7th Transportation Brigade, the crews assembled a pier at sea and opened a working corridor across the water. The weather fought them the whole way. Heavy seas damaged the structure more than once, and the system still managed to move nearly 20 million pounds of aid onto a coastline with no functioning port left standing. That's the shoreline problem, solved in the real world, not on paper. None of that capability comes free, though. A floating parking lot of tanks is expensive to maintain against corrosion, and in an age of long-range precision missiles, a large fixed target sitting still is precisely what nobody wants to be. So these ships are drifting into their twilight now, moving one by one out of active service and into the reserve fleet, kept ready, but no longer standing at the front. The hulls are aging. The question they were built to answer is not, and it's worth sitting with that for a moment. Is a country's real strength the equipment it owns, or only the equipment it can actually put in the right place at the right time? People who grew up watching news footage of tanks rolling off ships onto some faraway beach rarely stop to ask how those tanks got there in the first place. And once you know the answer, it's hard to look at footage like that the same way again. Which brings the story back to where it started. That same row of Abrams tanks sitting on the concrete pier, turrets forward, facing nothing but open ocean. The question was always how, and the full answer was never really about the size of the ship. The answer is the self-sustaining port. Stop depending on the harbor entirely, take the very idea of one, package it, and carry it with you. A ship like this doesn't need a dock, it is the dock. One answer to one question: how do you land a brigade somewhere? Nothing is waiting for it. That reframes what military power actually means. Power isn't something a country simply owns. It's something it can deliver to the right place at the right time. A tank sitting in a stateside motor pool isn't power. That same tank rolling down a ramp onto a beach 10,000 miles from home, ready to fight within the hour, that's power. The distance between those two things is a few 100,000 square feet of ocean-going steel, quietly doing its job. These ships are slipping into the reserve fleet now, and eventually some newer generation will take over the watch. But whatever carries that load next, the underlying problem never really changes. The most powerful army on the planet is helpless if it can't carry itself to the fight. So the real question was never how strong you are. It was always whether you can actually get there. And the answer to that has a name most people will never hear, sailing quietly over the horizon with a brigade in its belly, getting there so that whatever comes next can even begin.